All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. I'm your host, Leanne Lord. I am a stand-up comedian, and my comedy special, Even More Funny Women of a Certain Age, is now streaming. It's on Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV, and Google Play. Yay, home team. It is a real pleasure to be here with you. And FYI, on this day in 1776, the Continental Congress created a committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. I wonder what happened next. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Anyway, in other news for my Star Wars fans, rebellions are indeed built on hope. But moving on, everyone. Tonight's guest on Skeptical Inquirer Presents is Nate Pedersen. And I'm trying to pop the T there, well, the D there instead of the T, and so he doesn't get upset with me. He is so many of my favorite things. He's a librarian, historian, and freelance journalist with over 400 publications in print and online, including in The Guardian, The Believer, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the one that tickles me the most, The Art of Manliness. He's here with us tonight to talk pseudoscience. Now, pseudoscience has been with us for a very long time and has taken many forms over the years, from the easily disproved to the wildly speculative, and that's being kind, from wishful thinking to straight up hucksterism. Our fascination with pseudoscience is incredibly persistent, and even today, it attracts some passionate supporters to all manner of nonsensical ideas. But the real question is why? Nate Pedersen and his co-author, Lydia Kang, explore the what and the why in their recent book, Pseudoscience, an amusing history of crackpot ideas and why we love them. The book is a mix of history, pop culture, and good old-fashioned science. And Nate will discuss what he's learned about like why people insist on believing things such as Bigfoot, like seriously, astrology. Yeah, okay, I'm a Virgo, so I get it. And the existence of aliens. And you know aliens exist if you've ever been on Tinder. That's not hard. My friends, if you are joining us live, you have the awesome opportunity to ask questions about tonight's presentation by typing them into the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of them as we can. But this is a fun one, and I'm happy to be here for it. And I'm just tickled to say, and now Skeptical Inquirer presents Nate Pedersen. Nate, my dear, you have the con.
Thanks so much, Leanne, and thank you so much, the Center, for having me here tonight. It's a real pleasure and it's a real honor to sit in the seat that so many distinguished luminaries have sat in before me. It's a real honor to be here. So thank you for having me on. I am going to share a PowerPoint with you and have a fun conversation with you all tonight about pseudoscience. So let's get the technology in place and then we can launch in. Okay, so my name is Nate Pedersen, and I am the co-author of the book whose uh, cover you see here on the screen before you, Pseudoscience, an amusing history of crackpot ideas and why we love them, which just came out earlier this year. It's co-authored with Lydia Kang, who is a physician in Omaha, Nebraska, and a novelist and a writer of nonfiction books with me. And we have published two previous books. Our first one came out in 2017 called Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything. And our second book came out in 2021 and it's called Patient Zero, A Curious History of Epidemic Disease. So this book, Pseudoscience, that we'll be talking about tonight, was our first foray beyond medicine and into science more broadly. And it started, like our previous two books, as a kind of side obsession. Lydia and I both kept stumbling across these interesting stories, these bizarre, kind of baffling, sometimes kind of beautiful stories where people would make these interesting claims. It's claims that they could your personality from your skull, or perhaps power a machine without having an energy input, or even divine the future by watching chickens eat. And so we asked the question, why do people believe these things? And why do we want to believe in them? So we took a bit of a lighthearted approach to this book, to this topic. Our goal was to educate in part, but also to entertain. So we looked for bizarre and baffling stories that demonstrated lessons that we could look back on and maybe laugh at from history, examples from history, but also learn from at the same time. And as such, we purposely stayed away in this book from some of the pseudoscientific topics that deserved a more sobering treatment in a different tone entirely, which is why you won't find in these pages gay conversion therapy, racial superiority theory, for example. These topics have caused a great deal of harm in the world and deserve a different. Instead, the book is about things like UFOs and about ghost hunting, about Bigfoot, the 2012 apocalypse, or dowsing, astrology, or lie detectors, personality tests. As we phrased it in the introduction, we take a look back at the long arc of history to observe some of pseudoscience's crowning achievements. After all, it wasn't that long ago that we dragged out chickens to consult before deciding to attack an enemy, or delayed major political actions because of astrological signs. We've blamed Atlantean space beings for sinking ships in the Bermuda Triangle, and the quest to build a perpetual motion machine has been ongoing since the Middle Ages. And we still have a seemingly inexhaustible desire to watch people bring comically designed electronic devices into abandoned houses to prove that ghosts exist. We've tried to cheat death by freezing our corpses, and we've blamed everything, and we do mean everything, on aliens, UFOs. So when we wrote this book, we divided the chapters into four broad sections. The first section was called Pure Non-Science. Second section was called Aliens, Ghosts, Bigfoot, Atlantis, exclamation marks after each one. The third was called Wishful Thinking, and the fourth is called Drifters, Nihilism, and Denialism. And my goal tonight is to share some stories from each of these sections with you. But first, let's talk about what pseudoscience is. So officially, it's a system with theories, assumptions, and methods that are erroneously regarded as scientific. So that's Merriam-Webster's chiming in the official definition of pseudoscience. But put simply, it's something that looks like science and maybe even feels like science, but doesn't follow the rules of science. It skips the hard parts. There's not real testing, there's not peer review, there's no requirement of evidence. And as a result, it can offer these compelling things. It can offer certainty without proof, it can offer comfort without complexity, and most particularly, it can offer a compelling story. It often sticks around because enough of us want it to be true. I'm going to quote again from the introduction to our book, but are we really to blame? Human life is hard. The world can be a strange and terrifying place, and we all try to seek explanations for the unusual phenomena that we witness around us. It's not always easy to trust evidence that we can't see with our own eyes. After all, despite all the scientific proof to the contrary, you have to admit that sometimes the Earth really does seem kind of flat. So why do we believe in it? Why do we believe in this stuff, right? It's because we're human. And really, Lydia and I, as we approach this topic, the broad topic, pseudoscience in this book, are also people who sometimes have fallen prey to these beliefs. We're all human, right? And we have this desire to make the world a bit more mysterious around us. We're drawn to mystery. We're drawn to wonder, drawn to anything that gives us the sense of meaning or the sense of control, especially when the real world feels chaotic or unpredictable, right? So there's a playfulness sometimes about conspiracy theories that allow us to claim our identity. This is, again, a quote from the introduction. We can exert our beliefs in a world where we are constantly being told what to think and do. Staking a claim where you feel like you know the truth and others don't can feel really good. It helps create identity and in turn encourages you to bond with others. We're part of the same squad and act with the same belief system. It's a natural inclination, one that stretches back across the millennia to the dawn of time. It's the end of the excerpt from the introduction. But that's really what this talk is about. It's not just the strange ideas themselves, but why they're sticky, why they spread, and why they keep coming back, and how they can lead sometimes to some pretty strange and unexpected places. As humans, we love to find patterns and messages in everything around us, including our own bodies. And I'm sure everyone in the audience tonight has heard of palm reading or palmistry, where someone will read your future via the lines in your palms. But what you might not have heard of before tonight is the practice of rumpology, which is very similar to palmistry or palm reading, but with butts instead of palms. So this practice was reportedly coined by Jackie Stallone. And if that name sounds familiar, that's because she was indeed Sylvester Stallone, the actor's mother. So Jackie is a well-known psychic. She claimed that rumpology was an ancient practice with roots in Babylon, India, Greece, and Rome. She couldn't quite decide which there. But those were, of course, false claims. So that's something that's fairly common that you'll see, and folks that are advocating for pseudoscientific beliefs will often claim these supposedly ancient origins to lend this air of legitimacy. So Stallone believed that the shape, the folds, and the dimples of a person's buttocks could reveal their personality, their past, even their future. According to her, the left buttock represented your past, and the right buttock represented your future. The crack that separated the two, well, as for that, Jackie said that it, quote, represents the division between the yin and the yang, between light and darkness. So this gets at that common human desire to know the future, the idea that our destinies have been foretold and that the clues are out there, even in our bodies themselves, if we know how to read them, or if we're willing to pay $300 to Jackie Stallone to interpret them for us. Our bodies don't lie about their health. You can tell your doctor you've never smoked, but 50 years of 2 packs a day cannot be hidden when emphysema shows up on a scan. Or you can tell a police officer that you didn't drink, but your blood alcohol might say differently. In many ways, our bodies are even predictive about our future health. The body can't reveal our financial or our romantic future, and nor can they tell us what's going to happen next in the world around us. Desire to know the future, however, has been with humans since time immemorial and really flourished in ancient Rome. The human condition is one of relentless choice. Decisions face all of us every day, from the mundane to the profound. So it's no wonder that we look for support along the way, and we've long looked for signs to help us navigate the complexities around us. And sometimes as we search for answers, as we search for omens, we find our gaze drawn upwards to the sky. And what do we find there? Birds. So the practice of it's hard word for me to say, ornithomancy, which is to look for omens in bird behavior, is actually ancient, unlike rumpology. This one does go far back in history. It goes back to the Hittites in the 13th or 14th century BCE. And while many cultures practiced it, the Greeks enshrined it in their religious traditions, and the Romans basically perfected it. In ancient Rome, no state decision was made, no military campaign was launched, and no promotion was offered to anyone without first consulting the birds. In fact, you can make a convincing case that the Roman Republic was basically run by birds. A whole priestly class of individuals arose, called augurs, an example of which you see on the screen here, whose sole job was to interpret bird behavior for signs of divine will. The practice of interpreting these signs, taking the auspices, became such an enormously important function of ancient Roman statecraft that we still see echoes of it in our language today. Something is either auspicious, meaning conducive to success, or inauspicious, meaning unpromising. And to this day, we anoint our highest political office in the United States with an inauguration. Roots going right back to ancient Rome. With so much writing on their behavior, wild birds were a little bit too unpredictable because without an auspicious sign, Roman statecraft was effectively stalled. So the Romans turned to a bird that could be more reliably consulted. Enter the humble chicken. This is the ancient Roman mosaic, a rooster. So comparative intelligence of chickens was thought to mean that the chicken brain was more susceptible to divine influence. It was more susceptible to the will of the gods. And so chickens became the bird of choice for interpreting the auspices, for taking the auspices, and for deciding what to do next around a major decision. So a whole class of people called polariuses were employed to keep these chickens, to tend to them, to interpret their behavior, and advise on future course of action. So the polarius kept the chicken in a cage, or the multiple chickens, and then would open up the cage when a sign was needed and spread chicken feed along the ground. If the chickens appeared quickly from their cages, if the chickens ate greedily, those were considered good signs. Those were auspicious signs. And if they did not, it was inauspicious. It's not a good sign. By the way, if all of this seems incredibly susceptible to manipulation by the polarices themselves, as they could easily modify conditions to suit a certain outcome, while you wouldn't be wrong. Nevertheless, it was a really big deal in ancient Rome, and Roman generals would even consult these sacred chickens before battles. So wherever the Roman army went, and they went everywhere, a Polarius and a herd of chickens went along too, including to naval battles. In the Battle of Drepana, which took place in 249 BCE in the First Punic War between Rome and Carthage, the Roman naval commander Publius Claudius had the Carthaginian fleet pinned down off of the coast of Sicily and wanted to attack them. He was sure that he was going to succeed in this endeavor, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't launch his attack because he needed to have an auspicious sign from the gods first. So he was hugely disappointed when the player brought the chickens out on the boat that day, and the chickens weren't that hungry, and they did not emerge from their cage very quickly. It was a bad sign. The chickens seemed to think it was a bad idea to attack. The gods were expressing that will through them. So this Roman naval commander who thought he had had a sure thing on his hands was infuriated. He tossed the chickens overboard, which you see in the illustration here, reportedly shouting, if they won't eat, let them drink. And then he attacked. And he launched this disastrous night attack that led to what became the greatest Roman naval defeat of the entire war, with 90% of its fleet sunk or captured and 23,000 men killed or taken prisoner. Publius Claudius may have drowned the chickens, but they sure got their revenge from beyond their watery grave. So the point here is that people wanted divine guidance wrapped in ritual, a way to feel certainty. And you see echoes of this all the way up into today, right? It wasn't that long ago that the sitting president of the United States had and essentially had an astrologist on staff, or at least his wife did, and was regularly consulting an astrologist to make major American statecraft decisions. That same desire that we all have is writ large and with unfortunately larger consequences when it's brought up to the level of statecraft. But as for the birds themselves, science has shown that we can turn to them for some predictions, just not the same ones that Romans used chickens for in ancient Rome. Biologists that were studying golden winged warblers in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Tennessee observed that birds disappeared just 2 short days after they had arrived at their breeding grounds in the mountains. And they took off, they flew 932 miles away, they went back to the Gulf Coast, and they waited it out a few days, and they came back to the mountains. So why did they do this? The biologists were curious. What is going on here? Why did they abandon the breeding grounds so quickly? So what turned out to have happened is that the warblers had sensed the arrival of a very powerful storm system long before any other methods of forecasting had predicted the storm system would arrive. And the storm system is a big one. It spawned 84 tornadoes, it killed 35 people, and the warblers had departed the mountains days before the weather forecasters had issued their first warnings about the storm. So what was really going on there? It's still hard to say. Further study is needed to fully understand these subtle environmental cues, these subtle environmental signs that birds are able to interpret, but there is a pathway there toward interpreting bird behavior and perhaps basing decisions on it, just not the decisions that we're making named Pro. On to perpetual motion machines. So perpetual motion machine, this is the dream that won't ever die, the dream of perpetual motion. So people have spent centuries trying to build a machine that powers itself forever, that offers free energy without waste, no fuel, just endless motion. But this never works. It never has worked. It can't work as far as we understand physics. It violates the laws of thermodynamics, but that has not stopped people from trying. And one of my favorite characters in this field is a fellow named Charles Redheffer, who abruptly shows up in Philadelphia in 1812. And he claims to have built a perpetual motion machine. He says, I built this machine that can run forever. I'm going to put it on public display. You can see it working. So he does that, puts it on public display, and he charges admission. And this is sort of this funny, curious side note. He charged $5 for men, but only $1 for women to come in and see the perpetual motion machine in action. And he sat back and started to reap a nice pile of money. People were happy to pay that money to come in and check this thing out. This machine even caused a bit of a minor sensation in Philadelphia in 1812. People debated this machine in print. How did it work? Why was it working? So print and parlor rooms across the city were buzz with talk about Charles Redheffer's perpetual motion machine. So this is a diagram of what the machine looked like. The machine operated by a gravity-driven pendulum in which the output gear drove a vertical shaft in a whir of seemingly inexhaustible motion. The principle was that an inclined plane could receive continuous downward force from gravity and in turn produce a corresponding horizontal force that could operate some other machine. So in essence, it was basically a generator. Redheffer was pretty excited about his success and about how much money he was making from his exhibition. So he was emboldened enough to apply for city funds for the city of Philadelphia to build an exhibit and exhibit a larger version of this perpetual motion machine. The city, however, was not ready to just hand out a check to this guy, and they insisted on having an official inspection of the machine to see how it worked. And they sent off 8 city engineers to examine it. This is another little curious and funny historical side note. One of those engineers happened to have brought their kid to work that day. So guess it was bring your kid to work day. And that kid, in observing the machine in action, figured out what was going on. The kid saw that the gears were worn on the wrong side, meaning the machine was set up in reverse. That meant, in turn, that the machine was receiving power, not generating it. It was receiving power from another source. So his scam was up, and he was no longer a popular person in Philadelphia. So Charles Redheffer lit out of town and reappeared shortly after that in New York City. This is in an era, this is the 19th century. News travels a little bit slower back then. So he made a few tweaks and then he puts the machine on display again. But what he didn't count on as he started to make some money again was that the bad boy of 19th century mechanical engineering would shortly stop by his new exhibition in New York City. That's this guy here, Robert Fulton. And I'm sure that's a familiar name to some folks in the audience tonight. Robert Fulton really knew his stuff. He had, after all, designed a few big firsts. He designed the world's first steamboat, the world's first submarine, the world's first torpedo. So when this guy Fulton stopped by the exhibition, he quickly noticed something was off. The machine was oddly unsteady in its movements. It seemed to wobble. To Fulton, it was suggested that the machine was being manually driven, that there was a hidden person operating a crank. So he immediately challenged Redheffer about the machine, and he tore open some boards from the wall behind the machine, which in turn exposed a hidden catgut cord that ran to the second floor of the building. So Fulton followed the cord upstairs. He ran upstairs, and sure enough, what he found there was a startled old man who was distractedly churning away on a hand crank with one hand while trying to scarf down some bread with his other hand. And that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. So the difficulty inherent in trying to keep your crank moving at a steady pace with one hand while eating bread with the other explained the uneven motions of the machine, which Robert Fulton had observed. And the crowd that was around the exhibition that day that watched this sort of epic takedown of Charles Redheffer then expressed their anger at being duped by tearing apart Charles Redheffer's machine. And he slipped out of the pages of history. The dream of perpetual motion persists because it epitomizes an urge that we all have. It's this urge to get something for nothing. And the implications are, of course, intoxicating. If we had that ability to create free energy for all, we could say essentially goodbye to global warming, one thing. But the problem with perpetual motion is that it also happens to fly in the face of physics. though perhaps not quantum physics. So that's a talk for another day and by another person. But perpetual motion violates both the first and second laws of thermodynamics. So let's talk a little bit about why. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. If you are not adding energy to a system, you cannot take energy out and also expect it to operate indefinitely. The second law, thermodynamics, relates to entropy. It states that an isolated system will move toward a state of disorder. So entropy always increases over time. The more energy that is transformed, the more energy that is wasted. And some energy is always lost through friction, for example, or it'll dissipate in other ways. So not all of the energy produced can be harnessed, but a perpetual motion machine would require energy that is never wasted. It never moves towards entropy. You could, however, build a machine that lasts for a really, really long time. For example, machines operated by ocean currents would appear to be inexhaustible for all practical purposes within our human conception of time. But eventually, when the sun burns out, all the energy generated by ocean currents would also dissipate. So it can't truly be a perpetual motion machine if that happens. But the dream of free energy is so compelling that it truly will never die. And patent applications for perpetual motion machines continue to drift in to this day. Okay, on to spontaneous human combustion. So, spontaneous human combustion. This is the idea that human beings can, at random, burst into flames without an obvious source of ignition. They can go that some mysterious force at work inside the body can set it on fire from the inside out. And this notion caught the public imagination in the 19th century when death by fire was still a relatively common experience. And in those days, the world was basically a tinderbox. This Victorian interest in spontaneous human combustion was also connected to a scientific discovery that had been made in 1774, which is when oxygen was isolated for the first time. And scientists realized that this essential gas was critical for both breathing and for burning, and this gave rise to the theory that breathing itself was a form of combustion, a sort of continual burning of oxygen taking place in our lungs, which is kind of a beautiful theory. All these little fires that are burning away in your lungs, but it is also, of course, wrong. It is entirely incorrect. However, if you believed in that theory, it wasn't much of a leap to suggest that these little fires could sometimes flare up and overtake their hosts. Alcoholics were thought to be particularly susceptible to the phenomena. Their very organs were thought to be dripping with flammable alcohol. Another theory suggested that the alcohol they consumed was transmuted into a highly flammable gas within their bodies that just sort of floated around inside them, waiting for something to happen, waiting for a source of ignition. And this theory was not lost on the temperance movement. The temperance movement spread fear of spontaneous human combustion, and it was one of several tools they had in their tool chest that they employed to help stem the tide of 19th century drunkenness, which they really had their work cut out for. In those days, the average American drank at about the rate of 3 times of an American today. So people drinking a lot of alcohol. Charles Dickens himself was also a prominent believer in spontaneous human combustion. He was kind of obsessed, at least for a little while, by the topic. He read everything he could on the subject. In his novel Bleak House, an illustration of from Bleak House is on the screen here in front of me. In his novel Bleak House, he even killed off a minor character, the alcoholic rag dealer named Mr. Crook, via spontaneous human combustion. Dickens' reputation for realism, however, came under attack after the scene was first published in serial form in December of 1852. The critic George Lewis, up to that time a friend of Dickens as well as a lover of George Eliot, took pen to paper and published a highly critical review of the scene, accusing Dickens of, quote, committing the fault of raising the incredulity of his readers by supposing spontaneous human combustion to be a scientific truth when it was really just an error of imperfect science. Lewis is right, of course, but Dickens wasn't going to take that criticism sitting down. A full scale Victorian war of words ensued, with Dickens going to the trouble of adding a preface to the next serial part of Bleak House, pointing out scientific speculation about spontaneous human combustion and doubling down on this belief in his introduction to the final edition of the completed novel. These accounts, these accounts of spontaneous human combustion that were cited by Dickens as evidence were often vague and often poorly investigated. These were situations where people were found burned to ash in their chairs, with the room around them relatively untouched. That's a common feature all the way through today of supposed reports of spontaneous human combustion. These conditions found at these scenes can at first glance suggest something mysterious and maybe even supernatural. But modern science has a much less exciting, though much more gruesome explanation: the Wick effect. Basically, if someone is unconscious or immobile and they're exposed to a small flame, a cigarette perchance, ashes from a poorly tended fire, the body fat can act like a candle. So if there's a source of ignition, this is unfortunately something that can happen. The body fat can act like a candle, melting and feeding the flame over time. And the person's clothes help act as the wick. So picture an inside out candle with the fuel source being your body fat on the inside and the wick being your clothing on the outside. The wick effect is locally contained by the continual supply of a highly flammable source, i.e., your body fat, meaning the flames don't typically spread to your surroundings, and this is why you see such unusual conditions with supposed cases of spontaneous human combustion, where the body is burned to an unrecognizable crisp, but the couch on which the person was sitting is only minimally damaged. Eventually, just as a wax candle will gradually burn itself out, so will a human one. So the key point, though, is that human combustion is not ever actually spontaneous, but it is always tragic. And spontaneous human combustion deaths do have some commonalities. They're typically the kinds of things that occur among older folks, people who live alone, and people that don't have anyone nearby to help. So really, the lesson here is one of charity, to remember to check in on the vulnerable people in your community. Okay, on to one of my favorites, the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle is a supposedly cursed or haunted stretch of ocean between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, with each side of that triangle being about 1,000 miles in distance. And this is a section of the ocean where planes and ships just vanished. So, one of the most famous of the Bermuda Triangle stories is that of Flight 19. It's a group of 5 Navy bombers that disappeared in 1945 during a routine training flight off of the coast of Florida. In December of 1945, 5 Avenger torpedo bombers departed for Lauderdale, Florida on a routine training run. Their leader, they were headed by a guy named Charles C. Taylor, and the bombers intended to drop some bombs in a shallow coral reef and then proceed north over Grand Bahama Island before returning to Florida. Taylor was an experienced pilot. He had about 2,500 hours of flight time under his belt, and he had completed a successful aviation tour in the Pacific Theater during World War II. The weather forecast today was nothing special. It called for a few scattered showers, nothing out of the ordinary. So the pilots took off, completed the first part of the run without incident, but after heading toward the Bahamas, things went abruptly and irrevocably sideways. Taylor became disoriented, and he was convinced they were flying in the wrong direction, even though his training said otherwise. And the rest of the squadron, sometimes despite their own instincts, followed Taylor in this is disoriented, is just going further up to sea. They followed him out. And radio logs that were captured in 1945 display the confusion of the pilots. They were low on fuel, they were increasingly unsure of their location, and they were flying in rapidly and abruptly worsening weather. So, unfortunately, all contact was eventually lost, and the planes all disappeared. All 5 disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. So the Navy quickly launched a rescue mission, and further tragedy struck. A Martin PBM Mariner flying boat with 13 crew members that was sent out to find them also vanished. And to compound the mystery, no wreckage was ever found of any of these planes. And it became this foundational myth of the Bermuda Triangle. There's these 6 planes in 1945 that completely disappear. And there's 27 and gone, dead, disappeared, gone, without a trace. The myth of the Bermuda Triangle continued to grow because it was such a compelling mystery. And since the Bermuda Triangle area is one of the most highly trafficked stretches of ocean in the world, there were plenty of other seemingly mysterious losses of ships and planes in the area to add fuel to the mystery. By the 1970s, the idea of the Bermuda Triangle had really captured the popular imagination. Charles Berlitz's seminal tome, The Bermuda Triangle, became a national bestseller. That might be a book that some folks in the audience tonight have seen or even read. Theories about just what exactly was happening in this cursed stretch of ocean grew increasingly outlandish. Time warps were a favorite one. Time warps, this idea that a time warp would appear, the warning at some various random point in the triangle that unfortunate ships or aircraft could be caught in such a time warp. And then what happens next is they would, in theory, reappear at some future date and time. Apparently not yet. And they would return to their home ports without having aged at all. Or perhaps their ships would be found one day floating a lifeless sea with only skeletons aboard. Aliens were also commonly blamed. Aliens come up constantly in our book Pseudoscience. They're pretty much blamed for everything at some point or another. So aliens were natural connecting point here to the Bermuda Triangle. Some theories suggested there was high levels of UFO activities in the area. Others suggested that aliens living under the sea would occasionally capture sailors for study. Another theory suggested that an alien signal device was left in the Bermuda Triangle by exploratory aliens in ancient times. These devices would still send occasional signals into outer space, which then in turn disrupted navigational equipment of ships and aircraft and led to disaster. The 20th century psychic and clairvoyant Edgar Cayce surmised that the lost city of Atlantis sank off of the Bahamas, but its powerful energy source continued to pulsate away beneath the waves, also disrupting navigational equipment. The Bermuda Triangle is indeed a strange place, but not because of any supernatural forces. A variety of unusual environmental factors make it a particularly difficult stretch of ocean to navigate for ships and alike. One major factor is that the Gulf Stream flows right through the triangle, which is an extraordinarily fast and turbulent ocean current. And it quickly can erase and scatter debris and signs of disaster, and certainly accounts for many of the quote unquote mysterious disappearances of ships and planes that have been lost there. Also, the interplay of Caribbean and Atlantic weather patterns can lead to a rapidly developing weather incident on a local scale. Sudden thunderstorms or waterspouts, like you can see in this painting of the Gulf Stream here, can quickly spring up and overtake ships and aircraft. Also, the ocean floor topography can vary significantly between extensive shoals and some of the deepest marine trenches in the world. They're close by each other in this area, and it's constantly in a state of flux, regularly creating new and unexpected navigational hazards. These environmental factors make it a tricky place to navigate, and that can easily be compounded by human error. And when you add to this the fact that it is frequented by small boats and pleasure craft that are traveling between Florida and the Bahamas, you have a recipe for disaster. The Coast Guard has issued an official statement on the Bermuda Triangle, which I'll read now, just a paragraph here. The Coast Guard does not recognize the existence of the so-called Bermuda Triangle as a geographic area of specific hazard to ships or planes. In a review of many aircraft and vessel losses in the area over the years, there's nothing discovered that would indicate the casualties were the result of anything other than physical causes. No extraordinary factors have ever been identified. As for Flight 19, the best evidence today suggests that navigational errors, fuel shortages, and bad weather all combined in a kind of perfect storm that led to that disaster. Also, it turns out that Taylor, the lead pilot, had a history of getting lost. Likely, they all dished at sea and were unfortunately lost. They were never found again. And the rescue plane, further investigation reveals that it probably exploded midair from a fuel leak. So, what does the Bermuda Triangle show us? It shows that people love mysteries. They love to make the unknown seem even more mysterious. And you also see that in the study of cryptozoology, which is a study of animals that don't officially exist. You've all, I'm sure, heard of Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. This sort of map that I'm displaying on the screen shows you a lot of the other state monsters. You've got something like Jersey Devil over New Jersey. You've got Champ up in Vermont. You've got the Ozark Howler. You've got Tessie. You've got Skunk Apes. In fact, every single state in the country has its own cryptid, which is what we call these creatures that unofficially exist. These creatures that folks go out to look for that like to participate in cryptozoology. People love these legends. They love them for for good reason in a way, right? They hint that there's still mystery in the world. That maybe, just maybe there's something magical that's still hiding out there. Tonight I'm in Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania, one of the favorite cryptids here is called squonk. This is a sad, warty, pig-like creature that supposedly is covered in blemishes and loose, ill-fitting skin that lives in northern Pennsylvania and the hemlock forests in northern Pennsylvania. And the folkloric element about the squonk is that it's so ashamed of its appearance that it constantly cries. And if cornered or captured, the squonk will dissolve into a pool of its own tears. There's no evidence for any cryptid, of course, but people love the idea of hidden creatures and mysterious places. Cryptids feed our desire for mystery in a seemingly well explored, maybe overly explored world. And it can be this comforting idea that there's still mystery out there. So, the interesting thing to me, though, is that there's actually a lot of undiscovered species out there. They just tend to be a little bit smaller. There's even undiscovered bird species. Every now and then, some new bird will show up in Papua New Guinea, for example. There's just very unlikely to be a undiscovered mammal at this point in time. However, that doesn't stop people from keeping the hunt alive for Bigfoot or for any other of these cryptids. And really, it's kind of a harmless thing, right? If you want to spend your weekend hiking around in the backwoods of Washington looking for Bigfoot, well, there's certainly worse ways to spend your time. So all three of these three topics that we've just recently discussed here, so spontaneous human combustion, Bermuda Triangle, and cryptids, all succeed for kind of the same reason. They dangle this mystery that they refuse to resolve, and that mystery that's what keeps the story alive. It keeps people guessing. It keeps pseudoscience relevant, even as real science quietly offers a much less cinematic truth. You know, on a personal side note, I'm a birder myself, and I'm still holding out hope for the ivory-billed woodpecker to reappear one day in a Arkansas swamp. I think for me, that's where my sense of mystery and wonder is combined with my sense of science for something that might actually happen that I can actually pull for and that I would like to help hunt for sometime, right? But let's move on from our conversation about some of these stories to talk about why these ideas stick, why we love pseudoscience. Let's revisit that a bit. Because we talked a little bit about that at the beginning of this talk. As we're heading toward the end here, let's talk a little bit more about this. We don't love pseudoscience because we're foolish. It's because we're people, we're humans, we're curious people. We're meaning makers. We crave stories that explain the unexplainable, even if they're a little ridiculous. And sometimes, especially if they're a little ridiculous. Pseudoscience tends to thrive where you have mystery meeting desire, where you have uncertainty meeting pattern, and evidence is no match for a really good story. Pseudoscience can give us control when we feel powerless, and it can offer hope when answers are hard. And sometimes it's just entertaining, it's just fun. It's entertaining in a world that can be a little boring sometimes. And that's also how science can be. The scientific method is, after all, slow. It is excruciatingly slow at times, and it really needs to be. It should be. It takes time to sort out the signal from the noise. It takes time to draw firm conclusions that we can act on. And in the meantime, as Carl Sagan used to say, it's okay to reserve judgment until the evidence is in. So I think patience is important. We allow science to work through the process of testing hypotheses and coming up with answers. But what makes pseudoscience powerful isn't just its weirdness, it's this performance of it. It's this performance where pseudoscience wears the costume of science itself. It borrows its language, it borrows its language, it borrows its tools, it borrows its tone. And pseudoscience acts like it's based on evidence, even when it's not. And that makes all of the rest of our jobs as sort of skeptics, or as educators, or as historians, or as scientists, or just as learners, as lifelong learners. Our job is not to mock people and make fun of people who believe in these things, but to understand why they do and maybe to help them ask better questions. So it's important to keep being curious. It's important to keep looking under the hood of strange beliefs, not just to debunk them, but to understand what they offer to people. And when we hear a claim that seems too good or too weird to be true, it's important to remember the unofficial motto of the skeptic community, again, from our leading light of that community, Carl Sagan, is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So thank you all for listening. Our book Pseudoscience is available wherever books are sold or in your local libraries. I've also put up images of our other two books there, Quackery and Patient Zero. And I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop with my screen share now and we can open up to Q&A.
Nate, thank you so much. A couple of things. I think we might have dismissed this question, but it looks like you might have ghosts there behind you cheering you on, I guess because of the way the lighting is going. So way to set the scene for this. I have to confess that I might be having sacred chicken for dinner tonight. I had no
Fair.
idea I was being sacrilegious, and I was, there was the feeling to feel a little bit superior, like, oh my God, chickens, that's ridiculous, predicting the future. And then I realized we do Groundhog Day every year. Like we just wait for Punxsutawney Phil, like he actually, like this groundhog has any interest in our weather patterns. Um,
Well,
so
it's fun, right? It's the same thing where it's like it's a fun tradition, it's a fun ritual that we've added some meaning
yes,
to.
yes, and that goes to community. That seems to be a running theme. When the guest we had last month talked about, like, that's one of the things that pulls people in. It explains things. It's an exciting explanation, and on something harmless like say this or astrology, fine. It gets a little dicey when it's more than that. Um, Rumpology. I was sipping my coffee when you mentioned that, and I just like I'll spit it out uh, on my dress. But
Well,
it sounds like a 90s rap song. Like it really does, or something that would happen at a
totally.
Diddy party.
Gosh, absolutely. Yeah, that needs to be a rap song, my goodness. But yeah, no, that's yeah, you can pay $300 or you could have at one point in time to have Jackie Stallone take a good look at your butt, tell you what's going on with your future romantic life.
Yeah, yeah, I hear that's what goes on. It used to go on at Diddy parties, but I'm just gonna leave that there. And I love that you made the connection right up top that that pseudoscience looks like science. It sounds like science, but it's still a little bit accessible. And that's how they get you, if you're going to get got by these things. Um, I had another note here about the perpetual motion machine. You said it violates the laws of physics and capitalism. By the way, you can't be giving away free stuff. That's not what we do here on planet Earth, not at all. And I
Uh,
I feel like I'm sorry, please. I don't want to interrupt you.
oh no, I was just laughing. That's a great point. I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right. It does indeed violate every tenet of capitalism.
Feel free to add that in the next time you get to share your book with folks. And I you mentioned spontaneous human combustion, and that was a big thing. I think when I was in high school, like as new people come into the system, wherever you enter, that it might depend on what the big thing is. And I thought, like other kids, oh yeah, it's a real thing. And it put me in mind of the movie Firestarter. Well, it started as a book, Stephen King's book, Firestarter, as well as his book Langoliers. When you were talking about the Bermuda Triangle, so
Uh,
it's interesting how
right.
good how authors can take these things that are in the ether, this the pseudoscience, and make wonderful entertainment out of it if you remember that it's entertainment.
Which is key. Yeah, exactly.
And I will say one other thing you disproved something for me. I thought the Bermuda Triangle. I live in New York, so I thought it was JFK Airport, LaGuardia, and Newark. That's what I thought. The actual triangle had moved, and that's where it was because I've spent
That's where
time.
it is now.
That's where I've gotten lost. Where's Leanne? She's somewhere in between one of those three airports, you guys. That's what's happening.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I'm sorry. I just had to. I'm listening. I was taking notes. I was very excited. And once again, you guys, that
Well,
book, his book is available, and we are gonna go to questions. I swear. But I thank you so much for such an entertaining
oh,
talk. Oh my goodness.
thanks so much for having me.
Oh no, no, no. Yeah. And we're not done. We're not done. I just wanted to personally thank you for giving me these fun things to talk about. I'm gonna be so much fun at my next dinner party.
The goal.
It's Salvatore, I'm not ignoring you. That is a lot of text, and I'm going to put my glasses on. So I'm jumping to Jan's question because it's shorter and easier on my eyes at the moment. Wants to know, are people in the United States more gullible than in other developed nations? I would argue with the developed part at the moment, but that's the question. Are people in the United States more gullible than other developed nations?
No, I think, we all share this common human experience, and I think like levels of gullibility are part of that human experience, right? And I think it can express itself in unusual ways based on cultural background. Maybe that's what you see sometimes more of in the United States. And I think the United States also has a history of, like we get excited about things here, right? And things can kind of blow up here a bit. And I think that perhaps the reputation of gullibility comes from just I kind of am guessing where that question was sort of from. But I think that we have in America such a wide variety of choices available to us, and sometimes
Mm,
that can actually be sort of increased gullibility as well, because it's hard to parse out, the real from the unreal, from the fact from the fin, et cetera, when you have a lot of uh, sources of information, a lot of ways to consume information. And so I think, the ability, which probably might come up in other questions too, but the ability that we all have in America to create echo chambers amongst ourselves, echo chambers of our own worldviews, of our own news sources, when viewed by other people who are outside of that echo chamber, that probably can come across as gullible, especially if it's advocating for
mm.
something that is demonstrably not disproved. So I think that might get at your question a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess gullible is relative with as yes, depending on where you are. All right, Salvatore, I have tried to get to the heart of your question, and I like it actually. Salvatore says when what we accept as science today is proven false, because science is always testing itself and moving on when it discovers new things or has new evidence. Is what was previously agreed upon as reliable science then considered pseudoscience? I don't think it is. I don't think that's how your definition of pseudoscience is working. But what do we do with the old science? That doesn't just, does that automatically then become pseudoscience when we've moved on?
No, I think it's important to remember that science evolves and it's supposed to evolve, right? Like it's supposed
Right.
to change over time. It's supposed to continually test theories and come up with new answers that are better. And it's supposed to sort of be this continual process of refinement. It doesn't mean that people were like there's not that element of the con necessarily in pseudoscience, in the view that you just expressed there. That's more just the development of science as a discipline, as a practice. Pseudoscience has these other dressings that we add to it. It's where we're not actually taking into account evidence. We're not taking into account uh, the scientific method itself, right? I think you have situations where, like, I don't know, like DDT is an example. Like you have stuff that at one point in time, the scientific community thought this is an okay thing to use. Like DDT was thought this is an okay pesticide to deploy, and it's not, of course. And it took a while for us to figure that out. And unfortunately, there were some really tragic consequences of using DDT in the environment for a lot of years before science caught up with the real problems that were inherent in it. But that doesn't mean that the folks that advocated for DDT in that era were pseudoscientific. They were following the scientific method of that time, and that's what the results of the time showed them. They didn't have the long-term testing available yet. And certainly you can make arguments of how, well, then sure, they shouldn't have been using it in public. Absolutely, right. There's totally like policy decisions that come out of that we can debate endlessly. But the scientists behind that initially wouldn't be viewed by history as pseudoscientific. their aim was truly scientific. They just weren't quite there yet with maybe the repercussions of that.
Understood. We have a surprise, well, at least a surprise guest to me. Um, Neil Tyson, hey Neil, is in the audience. Thank you for
Oh
showing
my
up and
gosh.
being here. I know, right? Dude, that's a good get, right? I love it. I love it. Uh, and again, a good question. What is missing in the education or brain wiring of pedigreed scientists or engineers who promulgate pseudoscience? Because there are some folks out here who you think should know better and do not and are pushing the pseudoscience. What's missing again in the education? Or isn't it a question of education? Or are folks just trying to make
Yeah,
money?
I don't. Right, exactly. I think money enters into the picture a lot. I think I don't think it's necessarily a question of education. I think it's a question sometimes of the power of story. That's something we talked about a lot tonight, right? But I think that sometimes people get caught up in that to the point of not being willing to listen to evidence to the contrary. That's a pretty common thing. That again, like coming back to this
Hmm.
idea of echo chambers, these pseudoscientific echo chambers. It's like a compelling story, and I hope we told a few and talked about a few tonight. But a compelling story can override science, and I think a really good story can even override a highly scientific brain, right? And I think that sometimes that's or again, just like something that conforms to a worldview that you want to hold for whatever reason or another. Like and all of
Yeah.
us can be reluctant with different things that we claim to for our identities in particular, or reluctant to let go of, even if as evidence suggests that we should. And I think that's such a common human thing that it affects scientists and non-scientists alike, and hopefully, right, like scientists practice that element of withdrawing themselves a little bit from those questions to seek better answers. But I'm sure just like the rest of us, they're susceptible to not doing that at times too.
Yeah, that man, that confirmation bias, that just feels so good. Like I was already thinking that, and it feels good, and it comes with a good story. Like it's really hard to fight your brain, your own brain on that. But that's the call, everyone. Michelle, thank you for this question. This is a running theme for those of us who are invested in interacting with fellow human beings who don't necessarily believe the same things we do, and how do we do that? Wants to know if you can offer a word about when, if, or how to respond, if not initiate, in talking with people who believe uh, what we are skeptical of. And I'm been at that party. So, how do we do that? Can you offer a word about that,
Oh
perhaps, or is that
gosh, that's a hard
outside your
one.
bailiwick?
I mean, I can chat about it, but everything I say should take the grain of salt, of course, right? But I think
Hmm.
that A- absolutely, that's a thing to think about in terms of what's being discussed and the scale of damage that's implied by what's being discussed, right? Like this stuff is on a scale, right? Like when we're talking about astrology, and someone's having fun talking about how they're a Virgo and it made them, like be super organized for this lecture that they're hosting, right? Like maybe not the best time to have this epic astrological takedown, right? Like it's not really causing a whole lot of harm. It's kind of fun, read the room a little bit. But there are some really harmful pseudoscientific theories that do need to be addressed, that
Yes.
do need to be stopped, right? And then that's that whole human difficulty we all have of navigating uncomfortable conversations, right? Like, and we all approach that a little bit differently. There's probably not a one size fits all situation here, but often, empathy is a great thing to come back to no matter what the situation is. If you're empathetic and understanding and think to yourself, okay, like I'm not sure how they got to this view, but why don't I try to have a conversation about how they got there? And maybe along the way I can start sharing how I have my own view or have a skeptical view of what they've just said, or maybe a counterpoint to it. But I think laying the groundwork for understanding is really helpful. The last thing, no one wants to be just immediately condemned, no matter what their worldview is, even if it's terrible,
Definitely.
unfortunately, right? So I think
Hmm.
you need to lay groundwork by being compassionate, by being understanding, and then hopefully that in turn leads the pathway to successful communication, being willing to listen before you announce, being able to listen for a little while before you proclaim. I think those are key steps toward having a good conversation. But you can get there.
Yeah.
It just takes some time.
Yeah. I think we all wish it was just fast and quick. You just say, no, that's wrong, and here's the fact. And then the other person goes, oh, yeah. and that's not how that works at all. And even Linda, thank you so much, Linda, in your question saying harmless, quote unquote, pseudoscience often makes people susceptible to more harmful kinds. So clearly tackling it is important, and you are absolutely correct. We're coming close. Well, we were actually, yes, we were like seconds away from time. Uh, and Linda's actual question was, what can we do to individually tackle that misinformation on social media, which seems to it's a fire hose, it's
Gosh.
floodgates. You know, I, I
Right.
I've taken sometimes to putting like scopes. I just take scopes.com. Like, hey, fact check this, you guys. Like, just really quick. Like, but do you have
Right.
any
And that
thoughts
leads
on
to,
that?
well, that's a great question. I mean, that also leads to what role do social media companies have in entering into that debate too, the marketing content? I mean, and that's a highly controversial topic too, with a lot of really strong
Yeah.
feelings and opinions that are held going either way, right? So again, there's unfortunately not an easy answer. I do think though, to speak more broadly, that we that are in positions of power, meaning people that get to show up and talk, in situations like this, or people that are publishing newspaper or running a social media company, we all have a lot of power in this field. And I think it's important to be intentional about that power is utilized and recognize the influence that we all have, and to just make sure we open it up for discourse, but also like steer it in the direction that possibly over time restores some of the faith that's been lost in these sort of historical institutions like the media, right? Like there's a big drop in sort of vetted information sources that used to be relied upon to provide good quality information to people. And I think just collectively, if we're in positions of power and can help influence that over time, we perhaps can restore some trust and might lead to a little bit less of that kind of thing you see on social media with these sort of really strongly held opinions going back and forth. There's a lot of negativity and a lot of distrust of anything coming at them from like quote unquote mainstream. I think we that are part of that mainstream have a responsibility to restore some of that trust over time.
Yeah. And I agree. I think we each have an individual responsibility. Like, think before you share. Everybody, don't automatically pass on the clickbait. It's not appreciated at all. I know we have to wrap up, but this question disappeared somewhere. I think it was Stuart who asked what their state. He's in Connecticut. What the state animal is? The I forget the
Hmm.
phrase. The cryptid. Because I wanted to know what it was for New York. Because you described the one that if you see it, it starts crying and it disappears. And I'm like, that's junior high school. Like, I don't understand how that's a mystery. But we can't do all 50 states, but do you know what Connecticut is or New York is offhand?
I'm doing a Google search right now. So what is the Connecticut cryptid? Looks like we've got Bigfoot shows up in every state. There's claim to have shown
Well,
up in every
yeah.
state. So you can always come back to Bigfoot if you're puzzled over answering that question. But it looks like there's something called the black dog in Meridian and something called Pukwudgies. I'm not sure what that is, but that came up here in
Yeah.
a quick search. And then in New York, going to be close to the Jersey Devil there. But let's do another quick
Okay.
search here for
I'm
cryptids.
thinking it's
Oh,
the subway. No,
well, yeah,
that's
that's
so New
fair.
York City. I'm sorry, upstate.
Well, upstate, okay, upstate, you've got a pretty well-known one actually. You've got Champ. That's the lake monster, the kind of the
Oh,
Nessie that's supposed to live in Lake Champlain up there in upstate or
okay.
Vermont.
You could see how
So
much I get upstate. Albany's like as far as I go. Great parties on SUNY Albany's campus. Anyway, that's a whole
oh,
nother show.
you're
Uh, oh
you're
my
missing Champ. You got to get up there.
I am, but I love that Bigfoot has 50 state representation, so to
Absolutely.
speak. I always thought it was just somebody who had a really big shoe size and wasn't adequately served by the shoe industry here. But Nate, man, listen, thank you. I mean, for bringing a little lightness to the show, but also bringing science as well. When you can do both, as you said, to enlighten and entertain, is a wonderful thing. So thank you for your talk and for your book. And I just want to remind everyone, if you've missed any of tonight's presentation has been recorded and it will be available at skepticalinquirer.org. And as always, my thanks to Skeptical Inquirer, the Center for Inquiry, and of course to all of you in the audience for spending time with us tonight. Again, Nate, I thank you so much for being
Oh,
with
thank you
us.
so much, Dan. It's
And
been a real pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. Thank you so much for having me.
oh, yeah, our pleasure, our absolute pleasure. Everybody, if you don't know me, my name is Leanne Lord, and thank you for being with us, and good night.